Well, good evening. When right before we started, I was walking out the back door, and BC mentioned to me, it's been a while since I've given a lesson, so we may be here for a while. We may be out in 10 minutes. We'll see. So this morning, Bill was giving his lesson, and he kind of stole my thunder a little bit, because I was going to start off with 2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 2 through 4, when when Saul, is writing to Timothy, and he tells him, preach the word, be ready in every season and out of season. Convince, rebuke, exhort with all long-suffering and teaching. For the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine, but according to their own desires, because they have itching ears, they will heap up for themselves teachers, and they will turn their ears away from the truth and be turned aside to fables. But you be watchful in all things, endure afflictions, do the work of an evangelist, fulfill your ministry. Of course, I mean, we've all heard that verse before, and it's telling us to be ready, and it's also warning us about the false teachers of the world. And when I've heard that those verses, I've always thought about denominationalism and how denominations will go out and they look for people to tell them the things that they want to hear so that they can do Christianity the way they want to. But I've started to realize that this doesn't just apply to religion. This applies to non-religion also. Because the people of the world are doing this exact same thing. They're going out there and they're finding people that will tell them what they want to hear so that they can justify turning their backs on God. They choose to listen to anyone and any idea that will let them justify the things they do in life, the way that they live. And it's not a new problem. It's nothing that the world hasn't seen before. In Isaiah 30, verses 9 and 10, he says that this rebellious people, lying children who do not hear the law of the Lord, who say to the seers, do not see, and to the prophets, do not prophesy, to us right things, speak to us smooth things, prophesy deceit. And then this morning, Bill was reading from Romans chapter 1, and he's reading all of the things that were going on in the world at that time. And as we read through that list, we can see these are the same things that are happening today. And we got to ask ourselves why. Why is it like this? We've got three different eras. You've got Isaiah. You've got right after the resurrection and ascension of Christ, and you've got now, and you look at it, and it's the same things over and over again. And Solomon told us in Ezekiel 1:9, he says, that which has been is what will be. That which is done is what will be done. There is nothing new under the sun. We read in the Bible that God is the same today, yesterday, and tomorrow. Well, we're made in God's image, so we're the same. We're the same today, yesterday, and tomorrow. In that we have a sinful nature about us, though, and we want to do what we want to do, and we want to go it our own way. It's just the way of the world. Bill, this morning, he mentioned people that don't want to get into politics. And he also made one of his points that we need to protect our children from the influences of the world. Well, to do that, we have to recognize that it's not politics, it's just the way of the world. It is our sinful nature, and people are always trying to find ways to justify it. They can't just come out and say doing evil is right. They've got to dress it up. They got to make it look pretty, and they got to give it fancy names. So that way, they can feel easy in their conscience when they do the things that they want to do. For me, growing up, the name that I always heard these ideas passed along as was Postmodernism. And I really got into it about trying to remember. It was my English 1302 class that I took. I think it's been about a year now. But I really started researching postmodernism, because when I took 1301, they introduced us to an idea of writing called dual lingualism. And this is where, if you're a bilingual person, you can write in both languages. And you may start writing a little bit in English, and then you'll move in and you'll say some passages in Spanish. And we read this one particular article by a young woman that actually had gone to UT Pan Am there. It's probably about 10 years ago. And it was a really interesting essay that she had written. Of course, it took me a little bit longer to read it because I was having to translate the Spanish passage. I'd have to copy them over into Google Translate so I could read them. But it was a good passage. But then when we went into 1302, they introduced translingualism. And that one got a little more difficult, because with that, you could take and be writing all of your words in English, but you could use the syntax of Spanish. And so then it just looked like you were illiterate, because none of the words were in the right order for English, even though you were using Spanish syntax. Or you could be writing along in English, and then in the middle of your sentence, just throw in some Spanish words. And it didn't really matter. But as I started reading some of the articles that were doing this, they really didn't make any sense, and that it didn't look like it was a professionally done essay. And so I recognized it immediately for what it was, postmodernism. And of course, when I was a little kid, postmodernism was art and architecture and getting away from the straight lines and the perfectly drawn pictures of people and paintings. And it was getting into more shapes and distortions. But it moved beyond that, and it started moving into other realms. And so I started researching it, and that's what I did for my 1302 as a research class. So that's what I did. I did postmodernism, and what I discovered, what I learned was that, you know, it's a philosophical and it's a cultural movement, and it goes way back, and you can find its roots all the way back into the early 1600s with Rene Descartes and the other philosophers of the Renaissance era. But it starts out there, and they just it's slowly moving away from the more traditional and what was known as modern thought. And when by the time it gets into the middle of the 1800s, now you've got people like Karl Marx that are starting to influence this. And he writes his Communist Manifesto, and the thoughts start becoming Marxist thoughts, so that by the time you get into the 1800s, now people like Stalin and Hitler and Mao have started taking these beliefs and using them to run their countries. And when you get to the 1960s, it's become apparent that Marxism has fallen and has failed both economically and in the human atrocities that occur. And the French philosophers, realized that they can no longer justify teaching these ideas to people. And so they realized they've got to change Marxism. And the father of postmodernism, who is Jean Francis Lyotard, he takes his Marxist beliefs. He was a diehard Marxist up until the point he could no longer justify his beliefs in this system. So he takes it and he tweaks it and he manipulates it a little bit and he rebrands it as postmodernism. And he releases it onto the world. And so postmodernism comes out, and it's what's called a coherence theory. And this means that all knowledge comes to be seen as constructed within historical, self-contained systems of understanding. Okay? Coherence theories help to show our truth claims, our knowledge is developed. Where other theories, like correspondence theories, say that truth is a proposition as arising up from a relationship between that position and features or events in the world. Coherence theories say truth is a proposition as arising out of a relationship between that proposition and other propositions. And what this means is, a way to illustrate this is, if you're going down the road and you come across a drunk man and he's standing out there in the middle of the road and he tells you there's pink elephants doing the hula in the middle of the street, a traditional belief or coherence theory, no, not coherence, I'm sorry. The correspondence theory would say, I'm sorry, I've got myself confused. Yes. Coherence theory says that what this man is saying is false because science has proven that there is no such thing as a pink elephant and they cannot dance the hula. So we would know that the guy is drunk. Whereas a coherence theory such as postmodernism will go through a series of evaluating our own beliefs and propositions. Well, I believe elephants are gray, and this location doesn't normally have elephants, and there's no zoo nearby, and there's no circus, and severely intoxicated people have been known to experience hallucinations, and nobody else around here seems to see a pink elephant dancing in the middle of the street. So at this point, postmodernism will say, well, that guy is obviously drunk and doesn't know what he's talking about, and we need to take his car keys away from him. Not because anything he's saying can be evaluated as truth, but because we've made a correlation between what he says and what we believe. Generally, the proposition claim of a coherence theory of truth is considered true if and only if it coheres with blank. And each coherence theory will fill that blank in with a different statement, whether it's the beliefs of the majority of the people in one society, one's own beliefs, or maybe the beliefs of intellectuals in one society. This just depends on the theory as to what that something is going to be. The major theories say that coherence must at least be logically consistent. Unfortunately, with postmodernism, they've really forgotten about the logically consistent. Modern theories will fill in the blank to some controversy with the belief that most perspective or politically influenced person. Truth is based on them. Let's see. To them, the social negotiations among influential people construct the truth. They say that there is no objective reality outside of human collective decisions. Therefore, human beings are the ultimate arbitrators of what is true. Consensus is truth. And that's why you'll hear things like when they're talking about global warming, and they say that, well, there is a consensus among the scientists. 97% of scientists agree, even though those statements themselves can't be proven to be true. But as long as they say it, then that means that what they're saying must be truth, even though what they're saying may actually go against what science is telling us is truth. The way that I experienced this in my own life was when I first started going back to school. I took intro to environmental science, brackets around science, because I found a lot of the things that they were saying was fact, just didn't work with what reality said. One example of this is that the world is being overpopulated, and it just didn't sit with me. The idea that the world is being overpopulated. So I started looking at it and digging into it myself, and what I found is that this idea first came in the late 1700s by a man named Thomas Malthus. And he made the claim at this time, when there was less than 1 billion people on the planet, that we were about to be overpopulated. And he was suggesting that the population needed to be thinned out. And there have been others over the years that have made the same claims, that we're overpopulated, and claiming that there's going to be mass starvation, pestilence, irreparable damage to the planet. These are claims that I found hard to believe because the evidence was not supported by what was being taught. The population is over 7 billion now, and the cases of starvation and disease outbreaks have more to do with socioeconomic conditions than with worldwide overpopulation. And I would question the facts on this and other topics in class. And finally, one day, one of the other students told me that he wished that I would stop questioning everything, because he was there to hear the teacher and not what I had to say. This person and others in the class were willing to accept what they were being told without evidence to back up the claims that were being made. They said to themselves that this must be true because it coheres with what the professor is saying. And most college students are willing to go along with the consensus because the professor said so. So, what is the effect of this? There have been many minor effects. Of course, there have been effects on art. That's where we first started seeing the effects of postmodernism towards referral, nonlinear, abstract forms, a heightened degree of self the collapse of categories and convictions that had traditionally governed art. For the literary theorists, postmodern among the Marxist and feminist thought combined all human discourse, that is to say, linking the area of language and knowledge into a topic of analysis. Literary theory is now an interdisciplinary body of cultural theory because the disciplines of linguistics, anthropological, psychoanalytics, and philosophical are drawn from postmodern theories. Whether or not this is good for literary theory or society as a whole, cultural theory now takes as its premise that in one way or another, human societies and knowledge is comprised of text. It is ruthlessly trying to become the foremost model of inquiry into the human condition. So what this means is that postmodern is coming in there and it's trying to take over the way we study even literature. When I took my reading class, we were reading a story called The Yellow Wallpaper. And it was written by a woman in at the end of the 1800s. And at that time, psychology was very barbaric by our standards, and especially towards women. They would do some pretty horrible things to women because they just didn't understand the human body and they didn't understand the mind. And many times women, after giving birth and when they would have postpartum depression, the prescribed treatment for this was isolation and bed rest. And they would take them and you'd lock them up in a room basically by themselves. And of course, most people when put into isolation end up going stir crazy basically. But at that time, they didn't realize it. And this woman, she was a writer, and she had a young daughter, and she went into postpartum depression. And her doctor prescribed this bed rest for her. And she went in there, and she was just getting worse and worse. And finally, she realized she was going to have to do something, or she was going to go completely insane. And she was able to get a friend of hers to bring her a pencil and some paper so that she could at least start writing something, anything. And she was able to bring herself out of it. And afterwards, she realized that what the doctors was doing was wrong. And so she wrote this story to try to convince the medical community that their prescription was wrong. And in the story, it talks about a woman who gives birth, goes into postpartum depression, and her husband and her brother are both psychiatrists. And so they tell her, we've got to put her in bed rest. So they have a country home, and they take her upstairs to the country home, and there's this old yellow flaking wallpaper. And she's up there by herself for most of the time. Every now and then somebody brings her food, but the rest of the time she's just up there in this room by herself. And all she can really do is look out the window. And as she looks out the window, she starts seeing this woman creeping down in the garden. And the story goes on, and you can see the madness building until finally the woman is up there creeping behind the wall in her room. And she goes completely insane, and she starts tearing down this old yellow wallpaper. And at the end of the story, the husband and the brother come up, and she's sitting there, and she's become the woman creeping inside the walls, just along the edge. And we read this story in class, and the teacher asked, "So what do you think this is about?" And a couple people said, "Well, this is obviously about male dominance over women, and how these men are just treating her horribly, and they don't care about her, they don't love her." And as soon as a couple people said that, everybody agreed. And postmodernism says, well, that's obviously what the story is about. It's your opinion, it's your belief, it's your coherent theory. It must be true if that's what you believe, even though it wasn't about that. And at the time, I wasn't really sure what it was about. That didn't sound right to me. It wasn't until later that I found an article talking about the story, and they interviewed the author. And she said that she went through it, and it nearly drove her insane. And she took a copy of the story to her doctor to get his reaction, and he just, no, what I did was right. Even though she was trying to tell him it was wrong. And now we know that it's wrong. And this is just one example of postmodernism in the secular world. But for us as Christians, we see postmodernism clashing with our beliefs when we look at things like feminism, the feminism of the world, and the femininity of women as described in the Bible. And the world wants to tell us that women should be just like men, and they should go out and behave just like men. Of course, this is very contradictory to the other statement where it says that men are worthless and nobody really needs a man, and who would want to be a man? But at the same time, they're telling women, you have to be just like a man. You have to behave like a man. And of course, they're not talking about a Christian man. They're talking about a worldly man who goes out and conquers the world, basically. But in the Bible, we read that a woman is to be loved and to be cherished by men. And a woman is to be a helper for her husband. And when we look at the way Jesus treated women in the Bible, he treated them with more respect than any other religious leader ever has. If you look at Muhammad from Islam, he had multiple wives, and he abused them and treated them horribly. When you look at Buddha, he was a prince who up in one day decided he didn't like being married. His wife had just had a child, and he saw it as an anchor, and he didn't want to live that life, so he just abandoned his wife and children, and he went off to discover himself. And this is how the Bible is teaching us the best way to live. As we go through and we study and we see how God lays out the framework for a family and how men and women are to work with each other, not against each other. Feminism tells women, fight against men, fight the patriarchy. Jesus says if you work together, then you'll have a better life. And you see that with racism and white privilege. The world tells minorities, it says that white people are holding you down, that white people have privilege because most of them have a mother and a father in a stable home, which is the way the Bible describes it. And it tells them that you'll never be able to have that. But the Bible says you can. The Bible says if you follow the outline that I've laid out for you, God says, then you can have a good life, and your children will have a good life. And this has led the world, the world to be full of anger and resentment, which is the exact opposite of the love and acceptance that we find in Christ. And it's important for our children to recognize these ideas when they're presented to them. Because the school districts are all in on this. The schools they're all for teaching these ideas. And that's why we see so much chaos in the world today, is because the world has been teaching and leading people away from God. And when you get away from God, you're unhappy and you're lost. And that's why we see so much violence in the world today. This is where the discernment that we read about in Proverbs comes in. Being able to listen to an idea and realize there's something wrong with that idea. Just like when I was in my environmental science class and the teacher's talking about overpopulation, it didn't sound right to me. And so I had to go out and I had to look at it for myself, and I had to find out, how does this fit in with what God says? God says he's going to take care of us. I don't think God would allow the planet to become overpopulated. He watches out for us all the time. And the scary thing is that most of these ideas are presented as wonderful and caring and the best way to live. And that's what you see with the homosexual community and the transgenders. The world is telling them, hey, you're okay. The way you can live the way you want, you can love whoever you want, even though when you look at their life and you look at if they're happy or not, when you look at transgenders, they are, trying to remember the exact number, but they are more likely to commit suicide than the regular population, even after they transition into the opposite sex. They transition and they discover that doesn't make them happy. They're still not satisfied. Many of them end up transitioning back, but they're left with the scars of the decisions that they have made. So we have to be able to discern whether what we're being taught is truth or not. You have to be able to look at it and see, is this lining up with what God wants for me? Does this line up with what God has promised to me? I want to encourage everyone, dig deeper into this stuff. Study this stuff for yourself. I mean, I'm just barely scratching into the surface of this. I mean, we could be here for days if we really wanted to dig into it. And it's important that y'all dig in and y'all learn for yourselves so that you'll be able to discern what is truth. What is it that God says about this? Is what the teacher telling me, does that really Is that really what's best for the world? Um, so I hope that y'all been able to get something out of this, and I hope that y'all are encouraged to dig deeper and to study. And I want to invite you to come up now if you have any thoughts or any concerns in your life that you need prayers for. Thank you.